Controversially or not, I think the ultra-processed food conversation will take a similar route to smoking. Food's a really interesting topic. It's so emotive and it's so nuanced and it's so layered and it's so complicated. But also, like, we're slightly trapped. Everyone has these impassioned beliefs of what you should do. You should have the Nordic diet, the Mediterranean diet, the this, the that. They're all the same. I think we spent the last 10 years talking about, does it matter what we eat? And I think we've now unequivocally answered that yes, it matters what we eat. We're kind of completely overcrowding our diet with foods that are detrimental to our health, and as a result, we're not eating the foods that are good for us. You take a very popular sweet and they'll have, say, 15 or 16 ingredient, and there's one which is one of the UK's most loved ones, and it only has one ingredient from a food source, which is coconut oil. Everything else is a non-food. Supermarkets run on tiny margins. They can't afford to stop stocking all these products, and at the moment we're just kind of moving issues around. The only way to change that is through
Ella, so lovely to see you.
And you, thank you for having me.
You last came on the podcast, I think it's about 3 years ago now, and I actually listened back to a bit of it, and we looked a lot at your life and your life story. Today I want to go in a different direction because there are really big themes that I want to explore with you today. But before we get to it, and I know having loved, as you can see, there's a sort of spaghetti mark or something on this cookbook, I've used it so much, but your new book, Healthy Made Simple, you say at the start, it can almost feel a bit laborious to go back onto your original story, yet it is important to contextualise everything that you're doing and the mission you're on. So in a sort of non-reductive way, in a sort of nutshell, tell us how, for listeners that don't know, how you stumbled across this mission that you're on.
Yes, absolutely. I know it's funny, I find myself so reluctant to kind of keep talking about myself to a degree. I'm sure you feel the same sometimes with your work, but equally that personal starting point of why you became interested in helping other people and talking about health and well-being and your mental health it does feel like it's the grounding that's so important. But for me, that was back in 2011, which I can't quite believe it was that long ago now. And I just got very, very ill out of nowhere. I'd spent the best part of that year in and out of hospital, and I was diagnosed with a condition that impaired the functioning of my autonomic nervous system. So all these things that should be automatic, like controlling your blood pressure, your digestion, circulation, for want of a better term, this was not medical, was just completely out of whack. So everything was completely dysregulated. And as a result, I had extreme chronic fatigue, dizziness. I would sleep for over 18 hours a day. I had constant pain. I lived with pins and needles all over my body. I had chronic infections that I was on antibiotics for 3 years for. Sort of nothing was working and no one really knew what to do about it. So I took lots and lots of repurposed medication that year. None of it really worked.
I mean, at times you were on like 25 different meds.
Yeah, I peaked at 25 different meds a day. And I was in it's really interesting looking back on it now, and also having spent the best part of 12 years learning about health and well-being. And while that started with food, now I have such a interest in that more 360 approach in our mental health. And I think at that point, I didn't really realise that apathy was a symptom of depression, but I was so apathetic, I was so checked out at that point that I almost didn't register that I was on that much medication. I sort of was disembodied from myself to some degree because I found it, I think, looking back at it, so difficult to accept that that was who I was and what my life was, that I, just sort of almost turned off mentally and sort of felt nothing, a complete numbness. But that numbness also meant that I didn't really have any impetus to look at anything else in my life and anything else I could do that would help me. And it was when I reached what I feel was my complete rock bottom that I realised for the first time really in a year where I actually was and how bad it was. And in that it was so clear, like I was never going to be able to do anything I thought I'd do in my life. And I didn't have any really big career goals. I didn't know what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do, but I did know, I wanted to have a job, I wanted to live independently, I wanted to have the option to have children and do all these things that I had to some degree taken for granted. And it was really clear I wasn't going to be able to do any of that on that current trajectory. And that's what got me interested in what other people had done. I started reading people's stories all over the world and how they'd use facets of diet and lifestyle to change the way that their health was. And I was so inspired by it, and I thought if it worked for them, maybe it will work for me. So I'll give it a go, but I couldn't find any of the recipes I wanted, because back then, which I know seems so strange to say in 2024, we weren't having these conversations about the link between what we eat and how we feel and our health, certainly not in the mainstream. You couldn't find all these recipes for just like very simple day-to-day whole food focused plant-based meals. So I taught myself to cook, and that was the mission. It was always about trying to see this other way of approaching food, and could you put simple, natural, whole food ingredients in the middle of your plate and do it in a way that was actually enjoyable and delicious.
Do you find it disconcerting looking back that, considering you were on so much medication and you had so many symptoms and so many things that weren't working as they should, that the first port of call wasn't what's your diet, what are your stress levels like?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it speaks to a lot of the challenges that we have in our system today, which is that although the illness was not well understood, it was only had been quite recently sort of coined as a term and as an illness in and of itself. There was, I think, only 2 doctors in the UK specialising in it. It was very niche, and I understand that there weren't kind of clear roots and understandings at that point, but equally I had things like terrible acid reflux. Changing my diet would have definitely helped me with the acid reflux. Instead, at 21, I was taking medication for acid reflux. So I do think when I look back on it, there's some things I understand weren't concrete and people didn't understand enough to necessarily recommend. And then there's other things that I just can't get my head around, why we're not quicker to interject with all these different tools that are now available to us. And they are now so available. I mean, you can get 1,001 resources for free at the touch of your fingertips.
Yeah, exactly. I think people do feel much more empowered by having, I mean, maybe overwhelmed might be the case now, that there's so much information, it's about distilling it to go what works for you. But you, by trial and error, worked that out. So clearly changing your diet and approaching your lifestyle differently has helped you completely. You're not on any medication anymore, to be clear. How much of the illnesses you were experiencing do you think were due to eating processed foods / stress?
It's so hard to know, and ultimately I don't know. I don't know what caused it. No one knows what caused it. But if I look back on it, there were definitely a lot of quite complicated, heavily stressful factors in my life. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I would never see myself as a public figure, but having somewhat of a kind of public profile, I'm very conscious of what is your story to tell and what is not.
Of course.
And but yes, I think there was some very complicated facets of my childhood that had created, I think my nervous system was basically stuck in fight or flight. And it's taken me up until now, when I've started to understand much more about how the body works and what creates that, and about how your brain develops in childhood and all the rest of it, to understand that maybe that was the way that I felt, and try and unlearn a lot of that behaviour, which was definitely detrimental to my outlook and happiness. So I'm sure that there is a part of that in there, undoubtedly, but to what degree, who knows?
You can't,
exactly.
You can't measure that.
But it's one of those things, if someone had told me at the time, this is going to be the best thing that ever happened to you, I would have wanted to punch them in the face.
Mm-hmm.
Someone to tell you that your lowest point, where you're not really sure if it's worth living anymore, is going to be the best moment of your life. When you look back on it a decade or so later, it's so hard to fathom. I was so isolated. I was so lost. I felt I had nothing. And yet, honestly, getting ill has ended up opening up my life in the most extraordinary way, both from creating this career centered around a purpose, which I think is a real gift, but also introduced me to my husband, so that's our kids. And it's, there's nothing in my life that I think would be the same had I not have gotten ill.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I'm deeply interested in these rock bottom moments, because I absolutely feel the same. Like, if I hadn't been mentally rock bottom and totally lost and definitely apathetic about many things in my life, but really unsure of, like, what am I doing? And with a huge lack of self-esteem, like everything that rolls into feeling super low, I can now look back, not with complete peace, but I can see how it was one of the best pivotal moments in my entire life. How did you go from rock bottom to making any change? Because I think there will be people listening to this now who are rock bottom. You know, I've met many of them when I've been to the Happy Place Festival, and you have these amazing connections and conversations about, it could be one episode or just the podcast or whatever. And I've gained a lot myself, I think, from not only my own podcast, but listening to other people's and having an insight into how you create change. But when you're rock bottom, one of the hardest things to do is just take that first step in any direction. You're kind of stuck and it feels very stagnant. So what, looking back, do you think your first step was into going, well, I know I'm rock bottom, but there has to be some change or some momentum?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm sure it's not one with a kind of universal answer by any means. I think in my case, it was almost accepting that I was at rock bottom. That was the most helpful thing. I think up until that point, I hadn't wanted to take any personal responsibility for where I was. And it's not that being ill was my fault, but ultimately I lived with this sense of it's not fair, of why me, you know, looking at everybody else, be it people I had been at uni with, at school with, my siblings, and thinking, well, they get to do this, they get to do that. And I would, you know, refresh my Facebook page constantly. And I was almost, I think, quite addicted to watching other people's lives and thinking, this is so unfair. Why has this happened to me? So I definitely had quite a kind of victim mentality. And outside of that, it was just this sort of extreme apathy and just wanting everybody else to solve the problem. So, you know, I wanted the doctor to have the pills that I could just take and, you know, it would be a magic cure and I wouldn't really have to do anything. And I don't think I realised that was my mindset to this degree, but looking back on it, it definitely was. And, you know, I remember my dad saying, you are depressed, you need to go and talk to somebody. And I just couldn't. I couldn't even take responsibility to a degree for that because I couldn't accept that there was just one other thing that I was struggling with and not coping with outside of the physical health, the idea that it was my mental health as well. I just couldn't accept it. So I sort of couldn't accept any level of responsibility as to what was going on and whether or not I could play a role in it because I felt it was so unfair to be where I was. And it was really in waking up, I think, to that and realising how bad things were and what life would look like if I continued where I was, and realising, which is something I've tried to live with so much every day since, that ultimately the only person in charge of your life is you, and the only person that will have any impact on the outcome of your life is you. And it's so normal, I think, as humans to want other people to help us, and it's so normal to try and pass responsibility over, but ultimately, like, I think learning the more we can internalize the solution and the idea that us and us alone are in charge of the outcome of our life to a varying degree, but I think for most of us, you know, almost all the way, it was really realizing that, and that ultimately it had become so clear that no one else could do anything. No one else could make this go away, and it was up to me, and fundamentally up to me alone. Not that you can't lean on other people for support, but ultimately you're the driver of it. And I think it was in doing that, and it's so interesting. I still remember being at my parents' and being in my room and being on WordPress and registering deliciouslyella.com. You know, it's like a very visceral memory, and I felt a sense I hadn't felt in over a year at that point. Nothing had changed. It's not like my health was suddenly back, but I had just felt this sense of empowerment, like I am doing something. And as you said, I think it's so easy to underestimate how difficult that first step is, but how impactful just one step forward is. And doing anything, and you can create an amazing ripple effect from that. And just cooking that first recipe, and it wasn't complicated, it wasn't even very good, but it was this sense of like, no, I'm back, you know, in the driving seat basically, and that sense of empowerment, it's really powerful. And I think that's what it was for me, was just that and apathy was definitely my number one symptom from a mental perspective, and I think it was almost lifting myself outside of that apathy and therefore realising where I was. Apathy
is such an interesting one. I don't think I've talked about it anywhere near enough on this podcast, but I think it is a huge symptom for many people out there, and something we don't really know how to talk about, and we don't really understand perhaps how to move through it. But purpose has clearly been the way to get you out of that rut of feeling like, what's the point, nothing matters, because this is bigger than you. This cause is bigger than you as an individual. Like, yes, eating it in this plant-based way and eating whole foods and learning how to cook and have that connection with your food has allowed your physical symptoms to plateau and you're feeling really good and you're not on medication. But actually, this sense of purpose seems to be a huge portion of what's led you to feeling mentally better.
Oh, 100%. I always, like, Delicious Yellow completely saved me. And it's not just from the sense of exactly learning to cook and, you know, open up this whole interest in our health from a holistic perspective. And yes, that really helped me in a sort of, I guess, a more tangible, concrete way. But what really helped me was feeling like I had a purpose in my life again, and there was a reason to be here, and that you were contributing something that was beyond you. And whenever I found this journey, for want of a better word, in growing Delicious Yellow and building it, whenever I've found it difficult, which has been many a time, it's always coming back to that. And it's people's stories, like what you were saying at the Happy Place Festival. I'm sure the emails and things you get in after your show of people who listen to it, and at that moment in time, that's the conversation that they needed. I just believe so strongly that people inspire people, and it's this sense of, if you can do it, I can do it. There's something about these different conversations where you have something in there that resonates, that you relate to, and it's this idea that maybe that will help me too, and it's an amazing ripple effect.
Yeah.
And I remember just so quickly after I started writing, I would start to get messages from people around that topic. And, you know, well, thank you for normalising this. You know, I don't feel by myself. But those people stopped me from feeling by myself too. And I don't know if, you know, especially people that followed the brand in the early days, almost realised to what extent they enabled that as well.
Yeah, it's so the beautiful transaction of being honest with each other in any capacity, I think we really underestimate. I think so often we internalise all this stuff in our head of the worries we're having, the feelings we're having, and as soon as we say it out loud, there's that instant connection, and you don't feel alone. It could be your friend you're talking to, whoever else it is, doesn't feel alone, and it's freeing for you. Like, I even have it, say, I could be in the middle of doing a podcast or whatever, or doing it, like having a meeting, and have all of these worries going on in my head about this and that, and am I, you know, just also, and insecurities, and just saying them out loud is just the way to just get rid of it all and just go, this is how I'm feeling, this is what's going on in my head right now. It's such a powerful connection. Do you know what I think is really important to say is when we talk about purpose, it can, I guess, and I've certainly felt completely purposeless at points in my life. When you hear other people talk about purpose, you can really create it into this sort of fantasy of they've got purpose, it must feel amazing, and it's just all so fluid and easy. Having purpose is fucking hard. Having purpose is great, and it makes you feel alive and brilliant. It's not easy. It's not a simple linear path to anywhere. I think it's a really complicated choice that you make to follow something that you feel in your gut really passionate about.
Oh, totally. And I think certainly I look at us in the way that particularly we've built the business over the last decade. Goodness me, it would have been easier without that relentless purpose where I'm like, we will not do this, we will not do that, we're going to do it our own way, we're going to do it totally differently to everyone else and all industry norms. And you're consistently pushing water up a hill, and that's really challenging. And I think also when it matters that much to you, you know, you want it to be perfect. And I think that's definitely, I'm a very all or nothing person. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely kind of swing between, you know, 4,000 million trillion % and, oh my gosh, I'm so burnt out. I just want to lie down in a quiet room and become quite apathetic again quite quickly.
I hear you. And also, let's add into that complicated, you know, motion of having a purpose, the word food, which seems so loaded. Whenever anyone starts talking about food, people start to take it really personally. It feels like there's a lot of anger behind some of the rhetorics that are flying around. It's like, wow, I just feel like the food conversation feels like one of the I don't know, most disruptive places at the moment. And I feel nervous to talk about how I eat and what I believe in with food. But this is your mission. There's no way out for you. You're talking about it, and that isn't easy to do publicly.
No, I mean, I think you're right. Food's a really interesting topic because we obviously all eat every single day, and yet it's so emotive and it's so nuanced and it's so layered and it's so complicated. And it feels like we are collectively in such a bind around the way that we eat, the way we talk about what we eat, what it symbolizes to all of us. And it does feel wildly overcomplicated, but also like we're slightly trapped.
Yeah.
And the way I see it, at least, is that we need to take not a step back, but like a leap. You know, we need to run miles and miles back in the other direction and just take a deep breath and really, really simplify it. And, you know, over the last decade or so that I've been doing this, and you will have seen it all too, I'm sure, through your work, is that it's great because a decade ago we didn't talk about the fact that food was really important for our health. It wasn't a commonly understood premise that what we eat impacts our body, which is strange, you know. And I remember doing interviews when people would be like, sorry, let me just check. You're saying what you put into your body will affect your body? You're like, yeah.
That's the equation.
Yeah, and they're like,
wow,
madness. And I look back on it and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just cannot believe the level of skepticism with which we used to talk about this.
Yeah.
You know, it's also madness, but to some people that's, again, still a difficult conversation. But I think what's happened as we've started to talk about the connection between what we eat and how we feel is we've suddenly got this like tribal community, which is so unnecessarily complicated, where everyone has these impassioned beliefs of what you should do. And every single day you open up the newspaper and it's like, you should have the Nordic diet, the Mediterranean diet, the this, the that, the next thing. And I saw it, and I think it was a week or so ago. I'm pretty sure it was something around the sort of Icelandic part of the world. And it was like, this is the route, you know, this is the diet. And ultimately, they're all the same. They're all telling you to eat less ultra-processed food and more simple, everyday ingredients, loads of fresh fruit and vegetables. And ultimately, in that sense, I also want to bang my head against the wall when I open that. People are like, this is the secret. And it's like, it's the same.
Yeah.
You're just swapping. That one had a little bit of pork instead of a bit more meat in the Mediterranean diet. Or, you know, the blue zones where they're mostly plant-based, so they're eating more chickpeas and all the rest of it. It's like, fundamentally, we're talking about the same thing here, which is that it's entirely like un-ultra processed. They're not eating emulsifiers and preservatives and stabilizers and flavorings. They're eating real food.
Yeah.
And ultimately, in that sense, I don't know why we're all arguing, which is why I'm desperate for us to kind of take such a leap backwards from this bizarre world we've created over the last decade, which I think is also so detrimental in so many ways to people actually taking a step forward with changing how they eat, because you feel you have to subscribe to one certain plan or one certain way of doing it, and you need a label and it needs to be clearly defined. And ultimately, you know, it's a personal decision, but for most people, that is entirely unrealistic. Like, the food landscape we live in means that almost everything on every shelf is ultra-processed. If you swap that for eating fresh food, you are winning. Yeah. It doesn't matter how you do it.
Yeah.
And again, I know some people really disagree with me on that because obviously, you know, everything that I do is about eating more plants. So they want me to come out and say, you should become 100% vegan or 100% plant-based. I just don't believe that because I don't think that's realistic for most people. That's a personal decision for me. I like that. That suits me. What I'm about is getting people to eat more plants. Let's eat more broccoli, more lentils, more chickpeas, less ultra-processed food. But ultimately, the balance in which you do it, how you do it, it's up to you. And people's lives are just so busy. They're juggling so many things. You have so many responsibilities. Even just cooking at home 2 or 3 times more a week would be A, amazing for your health, but B, not easy to do and not easy to swap. So I think this like just dogmatic, you're doing it wrong, I'm right, finger pointing, shouting at each other, throwing stones from one diet camp to another, when fundamentally all you're doing is telling people to eat more whole food ingredients and less ultra-processed food. You're all on the same page.
Yeah, exactly.
But it just makes it feel so complicated and so unnecessary, and I feel like it puts up so many barriers which we're desperately in need of dismantling from a collective perspective, because we know the trajectory of our current health because of the fact that, 1 in 5 of us eat 80% of our calories from ultra-processed food. Like, we know what damage this is doing, and we need to change that. We're not going to change it if we keep making people feel that every single week there's a different celebrity diet or popular diet, and this is the list of rules and regulations, and it's this or it's nothing. And I always just feel, if you are wanting to make changes in your life, and that goes with how you eat, but other habits, whether that's meditating, running, whatever it is that you're interested in, if you don't feel you could be doing what you start tomorrow 10 years from now, don't start.
No.
It's not going to work. Anything that works is genuinely sustainable because it's genuinely enjoyable, and it's actually also plausible within your life, and your life is likely quite busy. And so the idea, I think, that we've just got wellness so associated with these really, really complicated, dogmatic ways of living, for me, is quite problematic. And it's the same with, I have loads of interesting research around cold water swimming and all the rest of it. But I think what's happened is that people now feel, ultimately, we live in a 24-hour news cycle. We have TikTok, we have all the algorithms, and it's much more interesting to watch someone go for a plunge in the freezing cold Arctic lake than it is to watch someone, do something with a tin of lentils or peel a carrot. And I think what's happened is, therefore, now we associate wellness with needing to do these slightly more niche pursuits. It's more interesting to read about adaptogens and all these sorts of things than it is, again, to talk about a tin of lentils from your local supermarket. That's not very interesting.
No.
And I think we'll try and make it as interesting as possible. But again, I think that's part of the challenge. It's now people look at it and they're like, I have to follow this set of rules. I need an ice bath in my garden. I need to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do this and journal and meditate and do 10,000 steps and exercise and sweat and do
You can't do anything else.
biohacking. And it's
impossible.
oh my gosh, you've got a full-time job. You've probably got other responsibilities on top of that. And so I think it's just this wild simplification that we need, which is ultimately just get outside a bit more, just walk a bit more, try and sleep a bit more, try and eat more vegetables.
Get off screens.
It's
so important. And actually, all we're doing is reversing time and probably going back to when our grandparents were cooking in the 50s
100%.
or 60s. I mean, I think, we've all seen, I was born in the early 80s, so I was definitely, and I had a very busy, working mum and dad. My mum must have had, 3 jobs at any one point. So she was put a pizza in the oven, chicken nuggets, alpha bites, all the shit that was around in the 80s and 90s, which made her life easier. We ate, and so did all of my friends, and it was just the norm. But things, like you say, have gone so far in that extreme that now you go to the supermarkets and it's hard to find something unless you're going straight to the fruit and veg section, which is unprocessed. Let's just get some basics covered. What's the difference between processed and ultra-processed, first of all?
There's a few different definitions, but I think, just on a personal level, the easiest way to think about it is pick something up and think, can I make this at home? Just look at the ingredients and be like, right, have I got that emulsifier in my house? No. Do I have that preservative? No. Have I got those 3 E numbers? No. Or could I make it look like this at home? You also look at stuff and you're like, goodness me, how many processes has that been through to make it look like this? Whereas if you look at something and you're like, I've got all those ingredients, or I could just buy all those ingredients in my local supermarket. Those are kitchen cupboard ingredients, and I could bake it or blend it, etc., like a soup, and turn it into that. Then that's fundamentally the difference.
Yeah.
Can you make it at home? Do you have those ingredients?
And the big problem being that ultra-processed foods are way cheaper, usually, than non-processed foods, than organic vegetables and fruit, etc. And obviously, I mean, this is why your book is brilliant, is that your recipes are quick. So you're making something and you can batch cook and you can put things in the freezer. But actually, ultra-processed foods are there for a reason. They're cheap and you pop them in the oven and they're already made. That's the barrier it seems we need to get over, because the food system is screwed. And also, not that we've probably got time to go into this today, but the whole farming system for farmers, they're under unbelievable pressure, underpaid. The whole system from start to the table is screwed. I mean, I'm not here asking what the answer is, but we need to acknowledge that we're in a deeply awful place when it comes to how we're receiving our food.
100%. I think the food system, as you said, from top to bottom, anywhere that you look at it, is entirely broken. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that for 2 reasons. A, because we need such large-scale intervention to actually change it. But B, because I think, therefore, if you are finding yourself eating so much of these sorts of ultra-processed foods, it's not your fault. And I think that's really, really important. I think we spent the last 10 years talking about, does it matter what we eat? And I think we've now unequivocally answered that, yes, it matters what we eat. It really impacts our health. We need to eat more fresh food. But now the question has shifted to how on earth do we allow people to do that? Because if you do, maybe someone's listening to this in their car and they stop at a petrol station, other than buying an apple or a banana, which is probably going to take up sub 1% of the footprint of that space, or a bottle of water, everything else almost universally in there, it's not even neutral, it's actively quite bad for you. Now, the problem with saying that is that if you take that soundbite out of context, people are trying to say, oh, that's a disaster. No, there's nothing wrong with having one, chocolate bar every now and again. That isn't the problem. The problem is the fact that it's about 2/3 of what we eat now. So we're kind of completely overcrowding our diet with foods that are detrimental to our health. And as a result, we're not eating the foods that are good for us. If you're mostly eating fresh fruits, vegetables, whole foods, etc., nothing's going to happen if you eat one or two of these ingredients. That isn't the problem. The problem is that our ratio is completely the wrong way around. So 1/3 of us get our 5 a day, 2/3 of our calories from ultra-processed food. We need to switch it.
Yes.
So I think that's why I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that if you are busy, you're time poor, you go around any meal deal, etc., that bread has multiple emulsifiers in. Like, a sandwich doesn't have 6 ingredients. A sandwich has 30 ingredients, 40 ingredients. And it's really starting when you start to look at that. But it's also very overwhelming of looking at how you're going to change it. So I do think it's so important to acknowledge how difficult the food landscape is, because so much onus is put in the individual to change their habits. And I just feel, for me, that's why kind of what we do at Delicious Yellow is so multi-pronged. I think I can give people every recipe idea under the sun, but ultimately if everything you find on shelf is full of those ultra-processed ingredients, it's not going to help you.
No.
And so it's been really interesting trying to see, can you make these products without using those ingredients, which ultimately what we've realised is that you can. And so why aren't we? And as you said, it's because it's cheaper, it's because it's quicker to do it that way. You have ultimate uniformity. And it's going to be so interesting to see how the landscape changes. I think, honestly, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I don't think we're going to see much change in the immediate future.
That's depressing.
Yeah, but it's so complicated. I mean, look, I think, controversially or not, I think the ultra-processed food conversation will take a similar route to smoking.
Yeah.
Which is that ultimately, it's such an enormous industry, and you start to look at so many of the products on shelf and they cannot be reformulated. You take a very popular sweet and they'll have, say, 15 or 16 ingredient, and there's one which is one of the UK's most loved ones, and it only has one ingredient from a food source, which is coconut oil. Everything else is a non-food. So you can't reformulate that product. There's no way. There are other things that, as I said, like we make cereal bars, and I look at the other cereal bars, I mean, you just don't need to add these ingredients. Flavor it with food, not flavorings. There's no need to add that emulsifier, etc. It makes the processes easier, but it's not necessary. So you can see this whole swathe of the shelves that could be reformulated. But then you see, actually, the majority of it really can't. You can't make sweets without adding 100 layers of ultra-processed foods. You look at, like, the crisp aisle, and you'd end up with basically ready salted only.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Because these companies are massive employers. They're important to the economy. Supermarkets run on tiny margins. They can't afford to stop stocking all these products. And at the moment, we're just kind of moving issues around. So the legislation to stop certain things being sold at the front of store means lots of companies have just reformulated. And instead of having sugar, they've just got more ultra-processed food to add the same flavours, etc. So for me, it's not solving any of the problems. And ultimately, to solve the problem, you'd need large-scale legislation like we had with smoking. And I think we're just at this interesting point now where there is this much larger scale awareness of ultra-processed food. It's about 2/3 of the UK feel that they understand it, they're interested in it. And I think you start to reach a tipping point where you can't unlearn what you've learned and you want something new. And ultimately, the only way to change that is through government legislation. And I think it will be very interesting to see where we get to, as I said. But it's going to take decades because it's so complicated to unwind.
Yeah.
And you can't just kind of pull those foods out because, as you were saying, if you go into the supermarket, that's the vast majority of what's on shelf. And the problem is the food is so much cheaper, and obviously in a kind of economic climate that we're in at the moment, it's really difficult to talk about that. But we spend much less on food in this country than we used to, and we spend much less than most of Europe does. So we spend kind of between 8 and 11% of household income on food, and in Europe it's kind of high teens. So, and that's more what we used to spend, decades ago. So I think it is interesting where we've gotten to with our food landscape and how difficult it is to unwind. But I think the thing that we found interesting building Delicious Yellow, and we've done over 100 products now, we've never used one of those ingredients. They just look at it, and I think there are lots of in cases where I just feel there's not really any excuse for using them at this point, and all the marketing and all the labelling is so confusing. I mean, like Cocoa Pop says on the front of pack, supporting your family's health. That's really difficult for people, isn't it? It's cheap, it's really appealing to kids, and it's telling you that it's good for your health. And I think that's my point. Like, it's not any individual person's fault for finding this landscape almost impossible to decipher, where those foods are colourful, those foods are cheap, your family will eat them. They're shown to be pretty addictive. And then on the other hand, the world of wellness feels fragmented and complicated, and all the kind of topics that get picked up are kind of more niche and weird and wacky because that's more interesting from a news cycle, clickbait, algorithm perspective. And so we've sort of lost this middle ground of like, eat some carrots, cook with a tin of lentils, go for a 15-minute walk on your lunch break, maybe do 5 minutes of breathing when you get home. These simple everyday tools that feel plausible for decades and decades and decades. We've sort of lost that in this myriad of shouting at each other, basically.
Yeah. And also because everything that you've just talked about, which is highly problematic for so many reasons, has been normalised, we therefore can look at someone like what you're doing and go, because you're the anomaly and you're going down the harder route, you've got your own factory now and you're making all of these products in a totally different way to the rest of the food industry, you stick out like a sore thumb, in my eyes, for the absolute best reason and to lead the way. And if anyone's interested in this conversation, especially when we look at farmers, we did a great episode with Andy Cato, who's doing a similar thing in the bread world. And I love what he's doing and sort of trying to change the landscape of farming. But you and all of us who are trying to do something positive in terms of improving people's and my own mental and physical health, you are exposed to all sorts of critique. And I actually commented on one of your Instagram posts at the start of the year, very passionately actually. I think I wrote way too much, but I was like,
no, it was amazing.
Fuck this. I was so angry. But you had put a post up because, I won't necessarily name the guy, but a journalist, seething journalist, had used you and what's the dart player guy
Luke
called?
Littler.
Yeah.
Luke Littler.
Yeah. And had basically put you out there together as one entity, saying you were both highly problematic in these extreme food diets. It's like, what you're doing, there's nothing extreme about it. You're talking about just
Oh no,
cooking.
he said I was peddling a death cult.
A death cult?
No, it was bone stupid narcissism peddling a death cult.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, this is how messed up our culture around food is, that we could call what you're doing a death cult.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It really is. And I think it's been so interesting. And I found that very difficult early on in my career. I think, like you were saying at the start, in your own experience, definitely what came to light for me was I'd always had quite low self-esteem. And then when I got ill, what was already low self-esteem became kind of just, absolutely
rock
gone,
bottom.
just none, a 0% self-esteem. And so I feel like that's taken me a long time to build back up. And I think early on in my career, I just didn't have the confidence to stand up for myself in any shape or form. And I found it very difficult to respond to these conversations and these comments. And I just found myself kind of shying away from it. And now I feel very passionately about being vocal in the way that this is such a kind of inappropriate and disproportionate way to talk about one another. And that's not that we can't disagree. I think disagreeing is very important. But ultimately you have to disagree in what is a respectful and non-vitriolic personal manner. And I think what's so interesting in the way that we often criticise, and to be honest, it's so often women, obviously in that case it was both genders, but I've definitely seen it for myself, and I'm sure you've seen it for you. It's a kind of universally acknowledged fact, unfortunately, that so much of this bizarrely personal, totally irrespective of what you do in your career, criticism is to women. And it's so unnecessary, and I find it very toxic. And I think it's as a mum now, I've got 2 little girls, and I just think if I can't stand up for myself, I don't know what example that sets to you too. So I did feel that was very important. And I think it comes back to, as you said, it's that purpose, it's that mission. I think what I realised was that was always going to be a part of the game, was having people that don't like you and people who don't like what you do. But if you're helping other people, ultimately, do those people matter? And I think I came to realise they can't matter and you can't really dwell on them. But equally, it doesn't mean that you can't stand up for yourself. And I think it's an interesting balance between the two, because someone was saying, but it sounds like you do care. And I was like, no, I genuinely, on a personal level, I don't care. I don't care that someone now calls me a bone stupid narcissist. That's fine. I respectfully disagree that I think I'm many things, but probably not that. But I do care that that's the way that we talk about women in the public eye. I do care that we think that that's appropriate to have in mainstream media as a way of disagreeing with each other. And those two can be separate. I care because I think it's an important topic for all of us as women, as opposed to caring because I'm upset that he called me that. At this point, I'm just like, good for you.
I mean, I am upset that he called you Axe. It's not fucking true. But also, I find it so problematic when we're looking at whether it is a plant-based diet, which, as you said, is your personal choice. It's also mine. And you've definitely helped me on my journey with that one. I sometimes feel like, about talking about food, because people are just, as we've talked about, it's so emotive and it gets so very personal. But I feel like what your mission is about cooking whole food. I think the plant-based bit to me comes secondary almost, because you can do this in a flexible way. So I think it got my back up, because I was like, no, don't distract from what we're talking about here, which is just cooking in a really simple way. And they're recipes that anyone can emulate. They're ingredients that we can all find, and it's going to make you feel better. It's not a diet. It's not a fad. And I think conflating the two is dangerous. I mean, it got my back up for loads of reasons, but I think to distract from that pissed me off.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? It's exactly that, is that what happens is then people feel so confused as what to do, as opposed to just like, let's just make some more broccoli, which is exactly the point. So it is interesting, and it is interesting to learn to navigate, but I feel very grateful to be what I think is the other side of it, to the point that I genuinely, on a personal level, I'm like, I know it will come, it genuinely doesn't matter.
And also I think when you're on a mission, like for you, I'm sure you kind of look ahead and think, well, it will never end. I'll just stay on this mission for as long as I can and help as many people as humanly possible.
Exactly. And of course, people will throw things at you along the way.
Moments,
exactly. It's an inevitable part of it.
It is hard though, isn't it? I hate it. Some days I think, I just want to hide. I don't want to do this anymore. Can't be arsed.
Yeah, I do. I went through a real phase of that, of just thinking like, I just don't want to be a part of this.
But also, do you know what I really love about you is that you don't play the game. Like you are now, whether you like it or not. You're well known. You're in the celebrity world, whether you like it or not. People see you as someone that they look up to and etc. But I don't see you going to all the parties and going to Fashion Week and all the bullshitty stuff that you can get dragged into. It feels like you're just doing your thing, and that's where your head's at.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been to any event. I'm a complete homebody, and that's it. Like, I'm just exactly. Like, I think it's twofold, isn't it? I wonder if it's the same for you, but it's taken me a long time to realise, like, that's what makes me really happy.
Yes.
And it's interesting, isn't it, when you grow up, because being cool, in inverted commas, has such clear parameters, I think. As a teenager in particular, you're cool if you go out a lot, and you're cool if you go out and you drink and you stay up late and all the rest of it. And it's quite a defined way of looking at essentially whether someone's like a great person or not. And I think it's taken me a long time to accept that's just not who I am. I'm not a sociable person. I love my close girlfriends, but I don't like being in busy rooms of people.
No,
I'm a complete introvert. Nothing makes me happier than going to a yoga class. Like, ultimately, that's my dream. If I've got an hour to myself and my husband's got the kids or something, that is where I'd like to be. And I love my work. I love going to work. And ultimately, like, that's what I think is really fun and exciting. And that's so kind of opposite of what you're brought up to feel like is cool and all the rest of it. But I'm so much happier for accepting that's 100% who I am. Like, getting into bed with a book after a bath.
Oh, don't. It's my favourite feeling.
Like, best thing in the world.
I literally look forward to it. When I wake up, I think, oh, I can't wait to get back in later with a book.
Oh my gosh, totally. If someone's
So
like, it's Saturday
sad.
night, you can go out to a big party, or you can stay, cook some dinner, watch a movie and read a book and be like, yes!
The best.
Exactly.
But I think you've got to that point early because I'm quite a bit older than you, and I pushed against that feeling like there was something wrong with me and I needed to have traditional fun for years. And I'd go out to parties, I'd go to events that I hated. I very rarely do now unless I really feel like either I'm supporting someone or a cause that I need to, then I'll go. But other than that, I'm at home. But I've probably only really understood my own definition of fun probably in the last 4 or 5 years. And fun to me is this. This is so fun to me.
Exactly.
Reorganising my bookshelves, the most fun thing ever. Or like clearing out a cupboard. Or having a one-on-one coffee with someone or a small dinner. Going to a big thing or doing... I hate organised fun. Like, organised fun to me is the least fun thing ever. And I'm just getting to grips with that now.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Like you said earlier, when we say things out loud, I wonder how many people are listening thinking, oh my gosh, that's me as well. But I don't feel like I can say it because I think people will judge me and they'll think I'm a loser. And it's such a bizarre word to use. I don't mean to sound like I'm 13 still, but I do think that way of looking at things that we have so deeply entrenched in us in school, it stays with us a very long time. So I think it's taken me a long time to realise, like, that's what I think's fun. That's what brings me joy in my life. That's what keeps me feeling energised. And I think as well, you know, I feel really strongly that life is a series of chapters, and I think you can do everything in your life, but you can't do everything in any one chapter, and you do have to choose, or at least I feel I have to choose what matters right now. And I've got 2 small children and I've got a very demanding job. And there's just no space outside of that without burning yourself out, you know, on a monthly basis, basically. You know, I feel like I just desperately need any pockets of time to tidy the house and breathe.
Yeah.
And without that, I just can't keep up. I feel like I'm on this hamster wheel and I stop enjoying things that I know I do enjoy. And I look at it and I'm like, I know, even in 10 years' time, you know, my children will be 13 and 14 and they'll be sleeping in and they'll probably go to sleepovers and they'll do all of this. And suddenly there will be more space in my life for other things to come in, and probably work will be a little bit less 24/7, 365 days a year than it is now. And that's great. And I'll really look forward to that. But at the moment, I'm trying to just be really grateful for what I have and where I am. And I think it's very easy to look at other people all the time and think, they're doing this, they're doing that, am I doing it wrong? But ultimately, like, everyone's life is so different, everyone's path is so different, everyone's week and their day and is so different, and what we need is so different. And I think it's just really accepting that sort of personal path has been a really big part of it.
I agree. Here's to books in bed.
Books in bed.
Even when your kids are at sleepovers, you'll still just want to get in bed with a book. It's the best
Yeah,
feeling on the planet. Ella, it's been so interesting talking to you today, and I think a conversation like this leaves lots of interesting loose ends for us to go off and all, you know more than anyone, but all go off and learn more about the food system and what we're eating and where it comes from and how it's made and all those things. I think it's real food for thought that we can go away and look into this more. And we all know it's still a problem. We can all do our tiny little bit without feeling, like you said, that burdensome feeling of it's all down to the individual to correct this. There's huge systemic problems in place, and hopefully down the line we'll see improvements. But for the moment, I think this is a really good starting point for many of us to sort of dive into this subject deeper. So thank you for providing such, beautifully easy to read and digest information. And as you know, I love your books so much. So thank you for making them and for being you. Thanks, Ella.
Thank you for having me.